want to talk to you about today is how to frame a discussion around some of the most important ideas that shape educational policy. In other words, what are some of the philosophical underpinnings of the educational system that we have today? Specifically, I want to think about what are some of the key differences in different philosophical approaches to education that grow out of, broadly speaking, pragmatist or Marxist versus classical liberal and religious approaches to education. And specifically, I want to talk about four thinkers whose writings have been enormously influential in education: John Dewey, Jacques Maritain, Paulo Freire, and Luigi Giussani. Alongside those foundational authors, I think it's important to consider more contemporary authors who've written about education in the United States, like William Damon of Stanford and his work on the moral development of students, or Jonathan Haidt and Greg Lukianoff and their work on student culture, student victimhood, as they say, or Elizabeth Corey and her work on love and friendship as the basis of a liberal arts education. Another kind of reason I care about this question so much goes back to Neil Postman's work in Amusing Ourselves to Death and the concerns he expressed there about entertainment, in some ways dumbing down our minds, and the juxtaposition of that problem with the Benedictine model of education as explained in Jean Leclerc, the love of learning and the desire for God. How do we relate these concepts of love of learning and desire for God with arguments that we need to maintain a core curriculum, as James Murphy argues? What about the role of beauty and creativity in truth-seeking, as posited by Roger Scruton or Jacques Maritain or Dana Gioia? And finally, I think a really important question in this debate about educational philosophy and policy is whether or not the liberal arts model of education, which was considered the foundation of higher ed and in many ways extended into K-12, whether or not that model is somehow inherently elitist, only for a few. And it's possible to do that by looking at debates between African-American scholars themselves, like Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois. More recently, Roosevelt Montas of Columbia University has argued that a liberal arts education is transformational for somebody like himself, an immigrant from the Dominican Republic. Nicanor Astriaco, a biologist of Filipino origin, argues that identity politics and classical education can actually be reconciled. They're not precisely doing the same things, but our situated contextual identity forms us in ways that I think Astriaco is arguing can actually be transcended through a classical liberal arts education. Well, my own interest in educational philosophy and policy has always tried to put the question of the human good at the center of educational policy. Although in some ways that may sound almost like a truism, well, what is education doing if not educating the human person? I actually think that there are long-standing debates on the nature of the human person that could be understood in order to better understand the kinds of educational systems we have. And in fact, I think very often debates about education never talk about what is the end of education and focus mostly on methods, how to educate, how to assess learning. Methods are important and a lot has been learned in those discussions, but the best methods in education are built on a holistic view of the person. So I agree with Jacques Maritain when he wrote in the mid-1950s that we urgently need to recover a vision of the human person as created for freedom as the basis for all educational policy. For Maritain, writing in Education at the Crossroads, the aim of education is to guide man in the evolving dynamism through which he shapes himself as a human person, armed with knowledge, strength of judgment, and moral virtues, while at the same time conveying to him the spiritual heritage of the nation and the civilization in which he is involved, and preserving in this way the centuries-old achievements of generations. Now, it's important here to consider that Maritain presents a concept of the human person that's grounded in a Neo-Aristotelian and Christian understanding of a human person, as he says, as, quote, an animal endowed with reason, whose supreme dignity is in the intellect, and man is a free individual in personal relation with God, whose supreme righteousness consists in voluntarily obeying the law of God. And man is a sinful and wounded creature called to the divine life and to the freedom of grace, whose supreme perfection consists in love. To think about education, part of what I think is important is to look at the history and the origin of the meaning of words. The very word education comes from the Latin verb educere, or drawing out, bringing someone out, leading someone out. So a true education for Maritain requires tapping our innate capacities to know the truth. Plato also would have seen education as essentially leading people. So what I think is also important from Maritain's understanding of the human person is that very often we forget that the human persons are a unity of mind, body, and the soul. One or another method of education focuses on one way that we learn, or one kind of knowledge that produced by the scientific method. John Dewey, for all of his advances and all of his interesting ideas on methods in education, ultimately conflates knowledge with the scientific method. But for Jacques Maritain, the scientific knowledge is one form of knowledge, but there's also moral knowledge, and there's poetic knowledge. And moral knowledge and poetic knowledge are not purely subjective. They are important ways that we reach the truth. So just as the human person is a unity of mind, body, and soul, there's a unity of truth and beauty and goodness. So that's why education can't simply become about educating people to a particular social role, as important as those roles may be for society. Education has to shape that inner dynamism, that inner spark that each person has been endowed with by our Creator. And that inner spark is about seeking the truth and being able to form judgments of action, but not only. The only purpose of knowledge isn't action, it's also forming judgments about moral truth, about right and wrong. These moral judgments, that is, the full education of the human person, can't only happen in schools. Schools are important. What happens in the classroom is important. But parents, faith communities, and civic culture all shape the inner dynamism of the student. And this inner dynamism needs to be distinguished from the Freudian subconscious of instincts and drives. The inner dynamism I'm talking about is a place of contemplation, of unity, but it's a place of contemplation and unity of our human capacities that works itself out in the world. A lot of discussions about education focus on what happens in the classroom and the interaction between student and teachers. There's no question that that is important, but the classroom isn't everything. It's the internal dynamism, the internal spark, which is what we're actually educating in families, schools, churches, as well as the practical life of being a member of a community and a nation. Jacques Maritain echoed beautifully, I think, in William Damon, would argue that teachers matter. Teachers matter a lot, but they're not the only educators. Another contemporary question, I think, in a lot of education is, what is authority and tradition? Tradition is not some kind of necrophilia, to use a word from Frere. The past is not something we simply study as a bunch of dead objects that we're trying to revive, but the past can become a starting point for our education. In fact, I think any teacher is starting, in some ways, is a living embodiment of a tradition. Tradition is a starting point for a journey, and as human beings, we can't start from nowhere. We have a past. People who don't who say they don't have a tradition in their views, I think are misleading. So as important as it is to focus on dialogue and coming to know oneself requires coming to know where one is in history, but also coming to know where one stands vis-a-vis traditions that have come before. And the authority of a tradition is not an arbitrary use of power. That's domination. I think the difference between power and authority is that tradition claims a source of authority outside of itself in the truth. Power is an arbitrary imposition of control of one person over another without having to give reasons. Finally, and I want to go more in depth on this point, some people have argued that a liberal arts education is elitist or not useful. But such an argument rests, I think, on a false dichotomy between a liberal arts education and a vocational education, or between liberal arts education and scientific education. I would also say that the only education that's the only education that's practical, or just for that matter, is a good education. A liberal arts education is practical because it helps students integrate knowledge across fields, and it helps further human flourishing. Carlo Lanciolotti, a scientist who's been very influenced by the Benedictine model of tradition, gives very practical examples of how a liberal arts tradition and integration of scientific inquiry with beauty, with contemplation, has actually led to discoveries, to creativity. And this creativity, this creative impulse of the human person is actually the engine of scientific development, not the technology itself. So, having gone through some of these misconceptions, I want to posit some insights that I think could shape educational policy today. These principles themselves aren't policies, but rather guidelines for policy. First of all, I think a good education needs to include the study of great texts because they're exemplary works. The idea of a core curriculum can also expand to include new works that are also excellent. But any system of education has to have a set of criteria for what counts as excellent works. And those works form a core curriculum. What exactly stays on the core curriculum is going to vary, whether it's a private school, which will certainly include more religious texts. A school that's focusing on science and technology could include more biographies of scientists. But people who are studying in a religious school or in a scientific program that doesn't always seem like it's going to fit with the liberal arts should nonetheless be exposed to these core ideas that have shaped human knowledge. And the great texts need to be, dare I say, appreciated for what is good. The critical method, the method of approaching learning where the most important thing is to find flaws and to identify weaknesses, needs to be balanced by an appreciative approach, trying to see what is good and what is beautiful, even if one doesn't ultimately agree with everything. And there's no reason to think that the core curriculum needs to exclude the voices of the so-called oppressed, whether those are minority or women. We all have a particular identity, but we all have a common humanity. And the texts that form the core curriculum that can speak both to a universal experience based on a particular identity, but meet this universal criteria of excellence. Another principle is that the human mind grows by being exposed to different forms of learning. Those forms of learning certainly include the scientific method, but also literature, music, grammar, rhetoric, logic. Everybody has a particular vocation and in a particular area in which they'll excel. But that doesn't mean we just educate people in one area. We need some exposure to the different ways that the mind works. If not, the danger becomes that one field of knowledge or one way of knowing becomes the right way or the only way to know something. Right now, or the only way to know something that's true. Right now, the way of knowing that seems to hold the prize on truth is the scientific method. And I would argue that the scientific method cannot tell us everything that is true that we need to know. Another principle is that education should encompass the aesthetic dimension of the human person and develop our capacity for poetic knowledge. As the philosopher Jacques Maritain writes, poetic experience is concerned with the created world and the enigmatic and innumerable relations of beings with each other. Poetic knowledge expresses itself in a work, in an object, through a dynamic process. Poetic knowledge is therefore communication between the soul and the world. And this way of thinking about aesthetics, the poetic form of knowledge, is a counterpoint to the modern tendency, which arises from the scientific method, to analyze and measure and manipulate everything. At times, that tendency to analyze and measure and manipulate needs to be passed over in order to return to a more contemplative, receptive way of looking at reality that opens up a deeper vision of the created world, a way of being present to all of reality in its totality without always having to conceptualize away or analyze things scientifically. Another principle is that friendship and hospitality are central to building communities of learners who know how to listen to each other and learn from each other. The concept of the self and the search for identity, I think, is very characteristic of our modern age. But when ideas of the self have been cut off from self-transcendence or from self-giving, or from the idea that the greatest fulfillment of ourself is not in seeking the good for ourselves, but in seeking to give of ourselves, then I think we end up with a self that's isolated, that's cut off, that's not connecting deeply, but focusing on fulfilling itself. So friendship, hospitality, charity, but charity and seeking the truth together. Charity is more than being nice or being polite. Charity is helping each other to find the truth. And charity, I would say, devoid of truth seeking, isn't the basis for true friendship. And I would echo the words of Roosevelt Montas that liberal education is an education for freedom. Liberal education isn't about liberal in the sense of left of center politics, but a life of freedom, a life that's not a life of slavery, but a life lived out of not a life lived out of compulsion or coercion or necessity, but a life in some ways of contemplation, of leisure, where our true freedom that characterizes us as humans can grow. It's only in free actions that our behavior can actually take on a moral quality. So the philosophical ideas behind the human person really do matter for how we think about education. I think the danger of moving away from the end of education as forming a whole person grounded in a liberal arts curriculum with friendship and hospitality, with a poetic aesthetic dimension to life, I think one of the effects of neglecting these principles is exactly the student and teacher burnout that we see. Human beings long to ask why. I think that's the central takeaway of The Risk of Education by Luigi Giussani, that the why question has to be brought out again and again. And it's because we care so much about the why question that we get our desire for learning and our love for the truth. Too often, learning can become the repetition of abstract ideas that can become meaningless, devoid of content. In some corners in education, there's a philosophical as well as a practical nihilism, that is the denial of a higher purpose to human life in education. I think that the concern about the loss of purpose in education has fueled a lot of the work of William Damon, and his argument that the human person is essentially purpose-driven. Yet at the same time, alongside the scientism, which has reduced everything about the human person to the scientific method, we also have this tendency of postmodernism to deny that there is any kind of ultimate truth. And for me, it's hard to see how the denial of ultimate truth from some postmodernist doesn't end in a kind of nihilism. If there's no answer that's objectively true about why we're here or where we're going, I just see a lot of young people falling under the weight of the meaninglessness that that implies. And in the long run, if the trends in education that lead to nihilism and burnout aren't countered by a core curriculum, teachers who love their subjects and love their students and love the truth, with a strong emphasis on human freedom, then I do fear that the forces of destruction will become stronger than proposals for the future we're trying to build. Several of the authors who I've read, Jacques Maritain, I also think W.E. Du Bois points this out. It's easier to destroy a civilization than to build one. It's easier to tear things down than to build them up. I think if we do uphold these principles that I've talked about, we are going to get more students and educators who care about preserving timeless truth, but also who know how to adapt them to the present circumstances and know how to make connections between the past and the present and the future. I think it's important to preserve what's good from history and tradition. Not seeing people who disagree as adversaries to be silenced, but friends. Friends that we might try to persuade with love and charity to see and seek the truth with us. And I think it's possible to take these principles that I've talked about and adapt them to different kinds of settings: private schools, public schools, technical schools, liberal arts colleges. I think these general principles on education serve all people because they're universal, because they're based on our universal conditions as humans, whether we're immigrants, minorities, women, people who haven't come from a long line of higher education or going to school at all. I think these principles are truly universal. And I think students' own testimonies, the development of a human person, of a full human person who's contributing to society, is the best evidence for this. There are plenty of exemplary educators who are moral exemplars in education, students and teachers who break through barriers, who swim against the stream to do this kind of work. Those models include people whose writings I really admire: Elizabeth Corey at Baylor University, Roosevelt Montas from Columbia, Robert George at Princeton University, Stephen Adubato, who went through Scala's programs on liberal arts education and teaches at St. Benedict's Prep in Newark, New Jersey, William Damon at Stanford University, and many, many others who I think are exemplary educators at all levels, swimming against the stream, trying to take these principles and apply them in practical ways in very different contexts. So in summary, I think the end of education is a development of the human person and forming that person to know how to be a self-learner, seeking the truth, who can build up civilization. And in order to do that, I think the best educational policies I can think of start with defining the content of the curriculum to include the liberal arts, with a connection between past, present, and future, with a unity between different forms of knowledge: scientific knowledge, moral knowledge, poetic knowledge. Teachers who love their students and love their subjects, an environment of friendship and hospitality and charity and seeking the truth together, and parents and civil society and communities of faith that cooperate with the schools in learning.